When you were little, what did you want to become in life? A carpenter. A nurse. Police officer. An interior designer. Preacher. That was Jack. It's not too late, Jack. What's that? A pilot, a teacher. How many in this room actually became, now this is where you get to raise your hand, how many in this room actually became what they thought they wanted to become?
By the grace of God.
There we are. Now I would say by the number of hands up that you and this church answering that question were above average in getting to become what you wanted to become. We've been talking about the question, what on earth are you here for? 2 weeks ago, we talked about the first calling, and the first calling was simply to be loved by God. Easy, right? Be loved by God. Turn to a neighbor and say, be loved by God. Then last week, we talked about how we're called not only to be loved by God, but we're called to belong to God's family. Repeat after me. I am called to belong to God's family. Those first two things bring us to the third calling in our lives. And this is where the little sheet in your bulletin that has a blank line, it'll have 8 of them, or 10 of them, or however many there are. It's kind of an outline of the sermon. It's designed for you to be able to take some notes and help you remember. Because remember, the only reason I'm up here preaching is to help you remember and learn and become who God has called you to be. And I'm still trying to help you not forget by the time the Cowboys half game is over. You know, of course, we have a little while before halftime's over now. The third calling, after you've been loved and after you belong, is to become. Well, to become what? To become, Scripture says, like Christ. So turn to a neighbor and say, calling number 3 is to become like Christ. So how do you do that? Well, I'm going to suggest that becoming like Christ is a whole lot like running a marathon. Now, some of you, as soon as I said that, went, I'm out, I'm a sprinter. No way, I'm not going out for 26.2 miles. You know, there's something going on in my world. More and more of the people that I'm friends with are in training to run marathons. More and more. It seems like every time I turn, I actually had 4 friends run the Dallas Marathon. The last time I was in Chicago for the Chicago Marathon, I knew 15 people who had decided to run the marathon. I don't know about you, but that's a long ways. And it takes some training. Paul knew that. 5 times in Scripture, Paul calls the Christian life, the life of discipleship, the life of becoming like Christ, a race. And in those passages, he gives us 8 different principles that help us become like Jesus. He says things like, to run the race, we need to, in verse 1 of Hebrews 12, strip off anything that slows us down, holds us back, especially those sins that wrap themselves around us and trip us up. Well, that doesn't fit on that line that I gave you very well, so I'm going to give you a phrase that will help you understand what this means. I think the first thing that Paul would tell us is that in our lives, we need to simplify our life. How many of you have complicated lives? How many of you seem to meet yourself coming and going? Even in church, isn't it true? We meet ourselves coming and going. Paul says we need to clean out the clutter. We need to clean out the closets. We need to clean out our minds. We need to clean out our schedules. We need to clean up and clean up our relationships. We need to get rid of the unnecessary baggage we're carrying around. You know, I've been making these trips to Portland to see my daughter. And I've been flying on Spirit Airlines. And if you know anything about Spirit Airlines, one of the things you find out is that if your bag doesn't fit under the seat in front of you, they bill you. Which is fine. They're upfront about it. You know it ahead of time. And even if you do have to put a bag on, it's still cheaper, or it has been for me, to fly on. So I'm not complaining. But one of the things that I learned is that I could pack enough stuff to be able to survive very nicely for a week in a bag, including my computer and a Bible and clothes and toiletries, all in a bag that would fit underneath that seat. Now, does that mean I have 17 different outfits for my 6 days there? No. But if I'm only there 6 days, I don't need 17 outfits. Now, some of you recognize who I'm talking to in the room. Don't laugh too hard, because they might be sitting next to you. But the fact of the matter is, Paul says we have to eliminate some of the things in our lives if we want to become more like Jesus. Think about Jesus. Think about how simple his life was. Now, I think if Jesus lived today, he'd have a laptop and he'd probably have a phone. He wouldn't need one. Well, I think it would make life easier looking back at Jesus' life. But how many times do we get our minds diverted from what's really important to us? You know, on that weekend we were together, we talked a lot about core values and the things that are important to us. And then we realized that the things we're saying that are really important to us really aren't the things we're living for. Most of the time we find ourselves living to make a living. Most of the time we find ourselves living to make ends meet so we can keep running faster. We keep living by a schedule that we're not in charge of. Paul says, simplify your life. Says, in a marathon, you don't run it in a parka. Do you ever notice that? Even in the cold marathons, nobody wears a coat. They strip down to the most barest essentials of clothing. They want nothing to weigh them down. They want nothing to hold them back. And that's our first real step of becoming like Jesus. Get rid of the stuff that holds you back. And I think one of the things that we could do is, we can do anything we can to simplify our lives. Most of us have way too much stuff. Most of us have too many things on our schedules. Most of us have too many obligations that we're not in charge of. One of the things that I've learned is that if we're not actually in charge of our obligations, if we're not actually in charge of our lives, if we're not actually in charge of what's happening around us, somebody else is. Isn't it true? Somebody else is. And do they really care, first and foremost, about you? Probably not. Probably not. So simplify your life. Secondly, now, by the way, that may be the hardest of the steps. But the second one, for some of us, is pretty difficult too. Not only do we have to simplify our lives, but we need to learn to not get in a hurry or be impatient. Any of you ever have trouble with patience? Or are you all perfectly patient for you right now? See, most of us are perfectly patient for me right now, for you. But the fact is, if you think about a long-distance runner, how do they start their race? Do they bolt out of the starting block and just sprint for miles? No. They start out and they have a pace. Sometimes they have a 6-mile pace. Sometimes they have an 8-mile pace. My pace would be, in a marathon, about a 27 to 42-minute pace. A little slower than some of the runners we know. It's about keeping on and keeping on and keeping on and keeping on. It's about not running out of gas before the race is over. It's kind of embarrassing to run out of gas, isn't it? Any of you ever run out of gas? I ran out of gas one day in my Ford Pinto. Well, if you're going to run out of gas in a car, that's the right one to run out of, because those of you who know, that's the one that if you got hit from behind, it blew up. It's really true. But I used to have a big engine in my Ford Pinto, and I used to race it. The one place you never wanted to run out of gas is in a race. I can remember 2 or 3 Indianapolis 500s where the guy is leading the race. It's sort of close, but he's enough ahead that if he can just keep going, he's going to win. Only to run out of gas and to be passed. You see, if we're really going to run the race of becoming like Christ, we have to be sure that we don't get winded, that we don't run out of steam before the race ends. Hebrews 12:1 does include a line about that. He says, let us run with patience the race that God has set before us. In other words, most of our races in this life are not sprints. Sometimes we have to hurry, but most of the time, what we're doing in our lives is called living life. And it's about going from here to there. And there is a long ways away. We don't often think of that in our instant society, but I'm going to tell you that in the race of life, there is no instant maturity. There is no magic pill that makes you become. Because God is never in a hurry. I don't know if you've ever noticed that, but God is very, very, very seldom in a hurry to make things happen. Do you know how I know that? Because God created mushrooms and oak trees. Mushrooms are instantaneous. They last momentarily. But oak trees, they're planted, and they grow, and they become, and they stay forever. Mushrooms, they sprout up, and then they're gone. You can spell maturity, I think, T-I-M-E. Becoming implies progression. It's not like instant coffee. It doesn't happen overnight. So step 1 is to what? Simplify our lives. Step 2 is to be patient. Step 3 is to spend time with Jesus every day. If you really want to become a follower of Jesus, if you really want to become a disciple, we have to spend time with Jesus. Now, I know that in church sometimes that sounds like so simple. It sounds like we shouldn't even have to list it. But you know, not one head out there went like this. No. Not one head shook in disagreement. Not one head. In fact, every head nearly said, yeah, we do. And here's why. And it's a fact and it's true, and it doesn't matter if you want to debate me on it. I'll just keep pointing at people. We become like the people we hang out with. We do. We become like the people we hang out with. Paul knew that. He even said it. Verse 2. It says, we do this by keeping our eyes on Jesus, on whom our faith depends from start to finish. In other words, if we put our eyes on someone other than Jesus for our faith will never grow. The only person we need to watch is Jesus. You cannot become like Christ without spending time with Christ. And the more time you spend, this is really the cool part, the more time we spend with Jesus, the more we're going to become like Jesus. And that doesn't mean you're going to become so heavenly minded you're no earthly good. It actually means just the opposite. It means the more time we spend with Jesus, the more impact and change we're going to bring to the world around us. As we become like Jesus, our world's going to change. Now, if you don't believe me, think about Moses just for a minute. When we met Moses, he's what? A baby. He's a nothing. He grew up in Pharaoh's household. But as circumstance had it, he became the leader of the Hebrews. And if you watch Moses, every so often he disappears. Do you know where he goes? He goes to the mountain. And you know who's on the mountain? God. And the more time he spends on the mountain, the more impact and change he brings to the people. And in fact, it's really amazing. The more time he spends with God, the more times when he comes back, people look at him and see him like God. In fact, it even says that as he came back from the mountain, again and again, his face glowed with the glory of God. Now, I don't know about you, but I'd like my face to glow with the glory of God. And since it's not really doing that yet, it probably means I'm not going to the mountain to be with God enough. But take a look around, because I don't see too many other faces glowing in this room either. So spending time with God, spending time with Jesus, probably ought to be moved up on our priority list. Paul said it this way. He says, as the Spirit of the Lord works within us, as we let the Spirit of the Lord work within us, we become more and more like him, and we reflect his glory even more. So we simplify our lives. We learn to be patient. We keep our eyes on Jesus. And fourth, we remember. We remember that when times or life get hard, when times or life gets hard, there is a reward. Now, we don't think about that in disciple churches very often. We don't think about having a great reward, but there is one out there waiting for us. Let me see if I can help us understand that. How many of you in this room ever have a problem? How many of you had a problem today? Maybe getting to church even. You see, problems, nobody's going to like this. I'll just tell you ahead of time. So get ready. But problems, my friends, are part of the becoming process. As you have problems, you learn to be patient. As you have problems, you learn to keep your eyes on Jesus. As you have problems, you become like Jesus. And if you don't believe me, listen to what we read this morning. Jesus did not give up because of the cross. Instead, because of the joy that was waiting for him, the reward, he thought nothing of the disgrace of dying on the cross, and he's now seated at the right hand of God's throne. Think of what Jesus went through, Paul says. How he put up with so much hatred from sinners. So do not let yourselves become discouraged so that you give up. You see, we have to remember there's a great reward. There is a great opportunity. There is a great hope. There is a great thing out there. And we don't know how far away it is. We really don't. We need to remember that discouragement is a choice. See, when I got to speak to the Lions Club, poor Dale had to listen to me twice this week. But I didn't give him this sermon, so, it was okay. I gave him one from 4 months ago. Not really. But I spoke to the Lions Club. And one of the things that I told them is that we get to choose to be either a victim or a victor. And most of us know people who are victims. They're the folks that go around going, why me? Oh, life is so hard. The mountains or the clouds always seem to find me to rain on. Of course, if you're in Texas and it's raining on you, you're happy. It's not true if you live in Seattle, by the way. Poor pitiful Pearl. Everything's bad. Everything's terrible. Life is so hard. How many of you like to be around that person? Careful, you might be sitting next to them. Or they might be sitting next to them. See, we get to choose to be a victim or a victor, and the perspective is who we keep our eyes on. The perspective is who we choose to remember. The perspective is our long-term reward, our long-term goal. What are we striving for? What are we living for? What are we changing our lives for? So it's really asking the question, who do you really want to be? Think about Moses. Was he a victim or a victor? Oh, hello? Think about Moses. Was he a victim or a victor? Victor. He was a victor. He won the battle because he went and spent time with God. He won the battle because even when he was impatient, he was more patient than just about everybody else we know. Think about Moses. His life was pretty simple. He went to the mountain and did normally what God told him to do. He didn't clutter it up with a lot of other things. When life got really complicated, he went and got some great advice and made his life even simpler. Moses knew to simplify his life. He knew to be patient. He knew to keep his eyes on God. He knew to remember the long-term reward. He was headed where? To the promised land. He knew where he was going. Now, the fifth thing that Paul tells us that we need to do is that we need to gather a team to run with us. I grew up in Hermiston, Oregon in high school. That's where I went. And we were famous for two athletic teams. One, our basketball team that was like the world's worst. When you're the best basketball team in the country, people like you. When you're the worst basketball team, everybody knows you too. I played on the worst basketball team. My junior year in high school, we were 0-32. Now the good news was, the next year after that, somebody else went 0-33. But when you lose 32 games in a row, that's kind of disheartening, and people know it. Just so you know, and this is really an aside to the story, we never lost a game by more than 5 points. We were in every single basketball game to the very end, including losing by 3 points to the eventual team that went 32-0 and won the state championship. We just couldn't get over the hump. In our races, though, the team that we were really famous for was our cross-country team. Now, you know about cross-country, right? These are people that get up and go run, and run, and run, and run. Every day, they go run. And they run as a team, and they run as a team. Usually, you have one guy on your team that's better than everybody else on your team, but he always runs with the team when you're practicing, except 2 days before the race, they would plan their strategy. Because cross-country is a team sport. You might be the state champion cross-country runner, but it's more fun to be the state champion cross-country team. And so you plan how to run your race so everyone finishes ahead of everybody else that's in comparative stages. My senior year in high school, we were the state champions in cross-country. I wasn't on the team. Jim Sebastian was the state championship running cross-country. Not only, though, did we win first, our team placed 6th, 7th, 8th, and 9th. And they did it because, as a team, they ran with Jim, and they just got to where they would run the other teams right into the ground. And they just kept the pressure on. And one guy would rotate. It was like watching a flock of geese. One guy would come to the front of the group, and everybody would run with him. And then somebody else would take the leadership, and they would run with him. And they would just keep running and running and running. You see, there's a great African proverb getting lots of press these days, and I thought you ought to hear it again. I'm sure you've heard it this week, actually. It says, to run fast, run by yourself. But to run far, run with others. And it's true. The writer of Hebrews put it this way: let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds. Let us not give up meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage one another as the day gets nearer. You see, my friends, together. You see, it's actually the second calling. We're called to belong to one another. And as we belong to one another, we build a team that works together, that becomes the church people want to see and be a part of. Being loved and belonging allows us and gives us the courage to become. It's really true. That brings me to the sixth thing I want to tell you about this. Sometimes we forget who our biggest cheerleader is. We need to remember that God is cheering us along at every stage of the race. Have you ever taught someone to ride a bicycle? I've taught 2 girls to ride bicycles. And it's always kind of an interesting thing because you put them on the bicycle and you tell them you got to pedal and you got to steer and so then you run along behind, kind of keep your hand on the seat, and you hope they don't pedal too fast if you're as slow as I am. And pretty soon they pull away from your hand, and what do? Do you not just go, oh, that's done? Not if you're like me. Not if you're like everybody else I know. Go, Jaylee, go, pedal, pedal. Watch out for the curb, pedal. You know, we encourage and cheer. And when they do it good, we stand up and scream and jump up and down. And when they fall, we run up, and what do we do? Oh, don't do it anymore. No. Get back on. Let's do it again. Wasn't it fun? Didn't you go fast? Of course, they went 2 miles an hour. But they thought they would run fast. Let God cheer you on. Now, there's lots of ways to let God cheer you on. One of the things is that we need to celebrate when we see people do good. How many of you saw anybody do something good this week? Did you see anybody do anything good? Did you celebrate it? Did you jump up and down and say, way to go? I'm going to tell you something. If you want to have a bigger impact, become a celebrator of what and when people do good. Change their lives by being an encouragement. Change their lives by praising them. All of these things that we're talking about help us become who Jesus has called us to be. They help us to become like Jesus. Number 7. Become like Jesus by making sure you take every step with purpose. Don't waste your steps. Don't waste your energy. Don't waste your time. Be disciplined. in life. It goes back to that very first one where we're called to simplify things. Well, one of the best things we can do to simplify our lives is to not keep adding things to the clutter. Paul tells us you have to be purpose-driven. Listen to this. He says, all athletes practice strict self-control. They do it to win the prize that will fade away, but we do it for the eternal prize. So I run straight towards the goal with purpose in every step. I'm not like a boxer who misses his punches. When you have a goal, when you see, you go towards it. You don't go this way to get there. You don't go this way to get there. You go that way. Paul even says it, or the writer of Hebrews puts it this way. He says, lift up your tired hands, strengthen your trembling knees, keep walking on straight paths. Don't take the detours. Don't be tempted by the crooked ways. Don't look for shortcuts or quick fixes. Stay on the straight and narrow. And then realize number 8. Realize that what you don't finish, God will. What you don't finish, God will. And that's important. Because listen to this. Paul writes, I am sure that God who began this good work within you will continue his work until it is finally finished on that day when Christ Jesus comes back again. What a day that will be. All your weaknesses gone. All your flaws and faults, your blemishes gone. All your frailties gone. You'll be changed into perfection. What a day that will be. What we don't finish in our lifetime, God will. Because, my friends, no one ever gets to the finish line perfect. Not the person sitting next to you, not the person standing in front of you. No one gets there perfect. You may have struggled in your race, we all have. You may have stumbled in the race, we all have. You may have even been silent. We all have. But the race is never over. The race never ends in the race of becoming like Jesus. And that's good news. You're loved and you belong, so you can become. It's a pretty simple process. And the good news is, God is never finished with us. No matter if you do all 8 steps, God's never there. God's never through. One of the oldest men I know, he was 97 when I heard him say this. He says, yeah, I keep thinking I'm going to die one of these days. But it's obvious to me, he says, God's not done with me yet. He lived to 106 years old. On his 105th birthday, his great-great-grandson was ordained into Christian ministry. And he believes to this day, he said, that was why God never finished him. Because when his family gave up on their grandson, he took him in. And he became. And that's the good news. Amen. Saying yes always starts with a first time, but it never ends. As our hymn of invitation and commitment today, I invite you to consider these 8 things that I've laid out before you, that Paul put out before us, and decide which one of the 8 you need to bring fully, more clearly into your life as you develop it today. Let's stand together as we sing, I Am Thine, O Lord.